This episode of the podcast is particularly special for me because it's the first time I've had a guest make a second appearance, and I also just had a lot of fun with the discussion. I speak with Ian Morris from Stanford University, who's an archaeologist, a historian, an author, and an expert on all things large-scale history. We discuss geopolitics from the perspective of the last 10,000 years of history. So questions like, can governments exist without the threat of violence? Is diversity a strength or a weakness from the perspective of the stability of states? Does the EU need to federate and build its own army in order to stay together long term? How do states use soft power to control and manipulate their own populations, as well as the populations of their adversaries? And what impact are we really able to have here on Earth in our brief time? Should we live for pleasure or should we strive for impact? This is a really good one and a discussion I really enjoyed, one of my favorites. So I hope you enjoy.
Escaped Sapiens.
I think in order to write a book like this, you actually have to genuinely love the British story, right? You have to love the history of Britain, which I really got. I mean, you put personality into this, which is really nice.
Thank you.
Should we start officially?
Yes.
So, Ian Morris, welcome back on the podcast. So you're officially the first guest to come on for a second time.
Oh, well, thank you. I feel very honored.
Well, thank you very much. So before beginning, I do want to plug your book because I do think it's fantastic. So, so for people who don't have who aren't watching on camera, this is Geography is Destiny. It's out in July 7th or June 7th.
It came out in Britain in May. It already came out there. And the US version is coming out on the 7th of June.
Yeah, it might be the most ambitious book about Brexit that's ever going to be written. So 10,000 years. It's the only Brexit book that cares about Caesar and the Normans. Probably.
Well, yeah, who knows?
But all right. So the goal of today, I really want to get an idea of what contemporary issues look like from the perspective of the last 10,000 years. So the big history. And I'm particularly interested in things like soft power and how narratives and stories shape history, as well as how geography and these big external factors shape history. So the ultimate goal is to get to those points. But I wanted to start somewhere a little bit more local. And I want to start with a question that I think will give some better idea of who you are as a person and how you got interested in big history. And so the question is, I noticed on reading your book, you have this throwaway comment where you mentioned that you were doing an excavation as a school child, as a schoolboy. Mm-hmm. So as a schoolboy, you were digging out some abbey or something. And it just got me thinking, how does a schoolboy get access to digging how do you get access to digging at an old religious site, before you've got some certificates or some qualifications? How do you end up in that sort of a situation?
Yeah, well, every country does archaeology differently. And in the British system, in the old days, like when I was a schoolboy, it was very decentralized. So you've got all these little local archaeological units, and local museums run their own projects. And they will often take volunteers. If you've got the sense to go and ask them, it's actually quite easy to go on a weekend and help out. And being a teenager, I did not have the sense God gave a flea. But luckily, my parents were great fans of education. And they both left school at 13, and my dad had gone to work down a coal mine at 13, and then he got out of the coal mine by getting qualifications. So great fans of education. And it sort of scared the pants off them when I told them I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist, because they rightly saw this is not really the path to fame and fortune. But they thought, okay, well, if this is what the lad wants to do, we should help him out with this. So they picked up the phone, called a few of the local museums, and one of them rather foolishly says, "Oh yeah, sure, send him along. Yeah, bring him along on Saturday. We'll put him to work digging." And so I got to dig on quite a few local excavations while I was still in school, and it was a really good thing. As a schoolboy, the directors would have to be mad to trust you to actually do anything, but you pick up a bunch of stuff by osmosis, really, because archaeology, it's one of those things where you can teach quite a lot about doing it in the classroom, but in the end of the day, you you look at all these diagrams on the blackboard of superimposed layers, all these things cross-cutting, is all very clever and serious. And then you go out there and you're standing face to face with mud. And this is what it's all about, getting into the mud and figuring out what's happening. And so you go along in these things and you learn a lot. And I learned a particular lot actually at that excavation at the Abbey. Just a lot of very strange things happened there.
Like what? Can you what's strange for an archaeologist?
Strange for an archaeologist. Well, some of them are not so strange for an archaeologist because they're things that happen all the time on excavations. But some of these actually were a bit weird. And so one of the highlights of the whole thing was in these Catholic abbeys in medieval England, they would bury the monks when they die. They bury them in different places according to their standing within the abbey. And so if you're a really big mucky muck, you get buried right up by the altar in the church, and your body gets put in a lead coffin. And these lead coffins are completely hermetically sealed, so nothing gets in or out, which means that you're very interested in the archaeologist because there's a potential to do all kinds of things with the body in there. But there are certain risks involved in this. And so with this one, these lead coffins, they weigh multiple tons. So you've got to get big, heavy equipment in to get it out of the ground. And so they bring in this big crane, put chains around the coffin. They're winching it up. What they don't, they say like a big event, so the Lord Mayor is there and all kinds of other dignitaries are there. They're winching it up. And what they don't realize is the lead coffin is cracked. So two things result from this. One is that there has been some air getting in and out, and the poor old abbot, his body has decayed in there, and he's now turned to liquid. The other thing that happens is as they winch it up, the strains, anything you try to jack up a car, anything you stuff, puts all these different strains on things. The strains start to pull the crack wider, and the coffin kind of explodes, and the Lord Mayor gets drenched in 600-year-old abbot juice, which as a 14-year-old boy, I thought this was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen, but it was actually turned out to be pretty bad. That had all kinds of repercussions for our permits to dig and stuff like that. Lord Mayors don't really like abbot juice drenchings. So weird stuff happens on excavations.
Is that still dangerous after 600 years? Can you still get disease from a body that's that old or not?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, it's super, super unlikely. It is sort of possible, but super, super unlikely.
And does it smell, or is it completely sort of denatured?
It smells terrible, yeah. Because all the stinks, the body rots, it smells really bad. And all the stinks have been trapped in there. I mean, a little bit was getting out because of the crack, but basically everything is trapped in there. And sometimes even sort of much more mundane things, like when I was digging in Sicily a few years ago, we had, for an archaeologist, this is one of the most exciting things that can happen. We found the town's garbage dump, and we were like, oh boy, we're over the moon now. Because garbage dumps are great, because obviously people are throwing all their garbage out there. So there's all these food scraps are concentrated in one place. So it makes it very easy to get a good snapshot of what people are eating. And then also you're going out there on a daily basis, tossing more stuff on. So you've got this beautifully stratified deposit with the layers, you're in chronological order. You can peel them off, date them, know exactly what's going on in each layer. But it really smelled. Every morning at a certain point, the sun would get to a certain angle and it would come, the sunlight would shine down into the trench. And as it heated up in the bottom of the trench, it really smelled of just decay and rot. And
that really surprises me.
3,000-year-old poo-poo.
Wow. I say wow, like it is sort of amazing that it has some impact after that much time.
Yeah, the flies loved it. Poor students I was sent down this trench to dig it out. The flies were just crawling over them all day long.
But I guess if it's been sealed, then there's been no access to it, and that's the reason why. So how do you get access to a site? Like, say do you have certificates? What are the qualifications? Are you do you fight with other archaeologists for the good sites, or how does that work?
Yes, we do. Yes, this is the main thing that archaeologists do is fight with each other. It fills most of our hours, but it varies enormously depending on what country you're in, and some countries like say Greece, Italy, Turkey especially, some countries really, really centralize. Everything is very bureaucratic, and even the tiniest decisions have to go to central government panels in the capital city. And when I was digging in Greece, when I was just a student at that point, on this one excavation in the 1980s, the director had to keep flying back to Athens to consult with them over whether we could even open a new trench. There was such a tight degree of control over what was going on. But other places, it's sort of a free-for-all. And some countries flip back and forth. Like Britain went through a phase where, like when I was in school, it was very decentralized, and it became much more centralized, and Whitehall took over almost all the permitting and everything. Now it's gone back to very decentralized. And so if I wanted to do a field project in Britain now, I would go and I would sort of wander around a little bit, talk to people, find out what people knew about things that they'd been disturbed by field work, digging or whatever. If I identified a site that I thought was worth pursuing, I would go talk to the landlord. And if I made an agreement with the landlord about access to the land, and if I had at least some sort of reasonable qualifications as an archaeologist, all I've got to do then is fill out some paperwork and I'm good to go. Whereas in the old days, you had to go through this years-long process of getting approval. And so it varies enormously.
I see. So if you could go anywhere in the world, so you get your dream location, what would you actually want to dig up? Like, there's no competition. You just get to put your flag down and off you go.
Well, in the old days, I could have answered that question really, really easily. But the problem with moving to global history and really long-term history is that, like, everything becomes interesting. So I've always got an answer for that, but it varies depending on what I happen to be working on at the moment. So what I'm working on at the moment for the new book that I'm working on is looking again at the origins of agriculture in the Near East. And so now if I had my druthers, I would probably go to what we call Natufian sites, which are sites dating between about 12,500 and about 10,500 BC, which is when we don't really know what's going on, but it's, you get them sort of spreading from Israel up into northern Syria, Lebanon kind of area, and it's not entirely clear whether these people were really beginning to do farming or whether something else is going on. And it's just really, really cool and fascinating. So that's where I would go right now. But if we talk again next month, I'll probably have a different answer.
Do we understand how agriculture did begin? Was it sort of a gradual process, or the reason why I'm curious about this is because, as far as I understand things, originally, agriculturalists weren't necessarily any healthier than hunter-gatherers. And, there's a huge time sink in actually going ahead and making a farm. And it's not clear that farmers were better off than hunter-gatherers in any way. So how did this transition, what was the benefit to the first movers?
Yeah, well, this is something where we've seen a lot of new thinking in the last 10 or 15 years. Because the sort of answers we had back in the 1990s, like say, for a lot of people, what they know about the beginning of agriculture will come from a book like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel. And when he wrote that book, it came out in 1997. When he wrote that book, it was kind of completely up to date on what all the archaeologists were saying. But that was 25 years ago, and now it's moved on dramatically. So 25 years ago, the thinking was, well, at the end of the Ice Age, around 9,500 BC, the end of the Ice Age, things warm up dramatically, of course, and the world gets a lot moister as well, because all that water's been trapped in the glaciers. Now it's released and can fall as rain and fertilize plants. And in what we now call the Middle East, there are certain areas where the wild predecessors of barley and wheat are growing just sort of naturally out in the wild. And these things start to grow a lot faster. There's just a lot more of them after the end of the Ice Age. So people start eating more and more of this stuff because it's more available now. And in the process of interacting with the plants, the things you do to encourage the growth, they create a selective environment that favors the evolution of new genetically modified organisms of wheat and barley. That the consequences that this modification has is that now, with wild wheat and barley, the seeds just sort of drop off all the time. They ripen at different times, drop all over the place. With the domesticated versions, which people kind of create by accident, they don't know they're doing this, but they create them by going out there and cutting the wheat and barley down and replanting the seeds. The seeds will all stay on the plant until you come along and cut it down. The little stalk attaching the seed to the plant gets much tougher. The husk around it gets much stronger. So all of the seeds stay there until you come and cut them down, which means that the amount you can get from the plant goes up dramatically. barley. People begin to realize this is happening, start doing things like weeding around them, watering them, deliberately replanting them, digging furrows and burying them. And so then the yields start to grow dramatically, and this process of genetic modification accelerates. And over the course of a few centuries, you go from wild plants to domesticated plants, and then the population just really explodes. Now, that was all seemed really straightforward, and the basic motor in that story is population growth. As you get more and more people in this post-Ice Age world, more and more pressure to exploit the plants more intensively leads to domestication. But it now turns out that's actually not how it worked. And we were saying all this 25 years ago because on the bits of evidence we then had, that looked to be what happened. But we now know that people had actually started cultivating wheat and barley quite intensively well before the end of the Ice Age, at least 3,000 years before, and maybe as much as 12,000 years before the end of the Ice Age. They're already cultivating wheat and barley, which should have led to domestication if the old theory is right. So why does this not happen? And the new version of the theory is that, well, there's no real change in what people do after the end of the Ice Age. People just carry on doing the kind of cultivation they've been doing before. What changes is the simple fact of the climate warming up. In fact, well, actually, not so much warming up. It gets warmer and wetter, but also the climate becomes much more stable. During the late Ice Age, you get these wild swings in the weather. They go way, way beyond anything that we're dealing with now in modern climate change. I mean, similar kinds of things, but much more extreme, much faster, much bigger scale. And what this meant was that probably the processes of domestication of wheat and barley did start as early as 21,000 BCE. It was underway. But every decade or so, you'll get some disastrous climatic thing. Your field of wheat that you've begun domesticating, it gets wiped out. You're set back to the starting line again. And there's just no way you can actually run this process of domestication, which takes thousands of years, we now know, to go through completely. No way you can actually run that because the climate is just too variable and too changeable. So it's not like we did anything clever after the end of the Ice Age, not like we started doing anything new. People just kept on doing what they'd been doing for thousands of years. But the world changed around them. And before they knew it, in fact, they probably didn't know it was happening at all. Their plants start turning into these domesticated variants. And as they do, this starts exerting new pressures on people. Now, because archaeologists like to say that it's not so much that humans domesticate wheat and barley. It's more that wheat and barley domesticate humans, because we start having to work harder and harder and harder to create these favorable niches where wheat and barley can flourish. It's like they're telling us what to do, with the one little detail that we eat them and they don't eat us. It's kind of an important detail. But other than that, we are responding to the cues being sent by the plants. And so we're working harder and harder. And as you mentioned about the diet thing, people's diets are worse after domestication than before, no doubt about that. But you've got, I guess, two problems you've got if you're an early farmer. One is you don't know that your diet is worse, because this is a process unfolding across thousands of years. There's no way for you to know what it would be like to be a hunter-gatherer. The other one is, say you somehow did know, and you wake up one morning and say, oh, yeah, screw this, plowing that field, that's hard work and it's boring and I don't like it. I'm going to go and live off hunting stuff now. That sounds much more fun and much healthier. You're going to last a few weeks because the process, once you start farming, it makes it almost impossible to survive as a hunter. All the animals get driven off. You clear cut the forest. You get rid of all the environmental niches the hunters need. And we do get this interesting thing where some places we can see farmers and hunters and gatherers living alongside each other for thousands of years. So the hunters and gatherers in territory the farmers don't really want. But basically anywhere farmers want to go, they can go, because one of the things domestication does is it drives this huge population increase. And so the hunter-gatherers are always outnumbered by the farmers. So, yeah, we get this an entirely new picture of the way it worked. And the sort of bottom line thing is now that we just think it took much, much longer than we used to think.
And so it collapsed multiple times. So it sounds like... Okay, so I want to get from that. I want to spring off into sort of this big history, because a key question that I have is the following. We like to look at history through the eyes of the great men, the Caesars and the Genghis Khans and so on. And these guys, they were successful. They conquered their enemies. They got the girl. They built these huge empires. But then, quite often, after they die, the empire collapses. The entire nation gets taken over by their neighbors. And so even these great men have their works undone. And from the perspective of agriculture starting up and then collapsing again and starting up and collapsing again, just based off, whether the weather was good, whether we were going through an ice age or, these external factors, I want to get some sort of a perspective on what impact does the individual have on history? Is there any sense in which we actually as individuals have any real say that's long-term on the way that history unfolds?
Yeah, well, this is one of the questions that pushed me into writing this new book, Geography is Destiny. I had started off my career working on reasonably focused problems. I started off working on ancient Greece, so looking at across the space of a few centuries, things that are going on in ancient Greece. And then as time went on, I found that if I broadened the perspective out, so I look at a bigger area, longer time scale, new answers emerged to these questions I'd got about ancient Greece. Then at a certain point, about 15, 20 years ago, I realized, I'm looking at such a big time scale and geographical scale now that what I'm actually interested in is the big questions about the whole world. Using the whole world to come up with a new way of looking at ancient Greece, that's less interesting to me now than just looking at the whole world and trying to talk about that. And so I wrote a series of books trying to produce these general theories of global history over the long run, and I had a huge amount of fun doing it. But then at a certain point, you're writing these books, and this question that you just asked about the role of the individual, there's no way to avoid that question. It keeps coming up. You keep having to think about it. And of course, the problem that you have as a global historian is that actual history is made by real people, not by vast impersonal forces operating beyond anybody's ken. It's actual people doing things, deciding things. That's what causes things to happen. So if your big global theories can't be used to explain what happens to real people in concrete situations, they're not really worth very much at all. So I've been thinking for some years, what I should do is write a book where I look at just one particular part of the world and not maybe on the million-year scale, get it down to at least a few thousand years, at least get it down that small, one particular part of the world, and try to see if my grand theories about geography and other stuff, whether they can really help me understand what was going on there. So I'm thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, Greece would be the obvious place to write about, since that's where I started my career. But then the citizens of the United Kingdom decide to vote to leave the European Union. And so the day after the vote, I think, of course, this is like a perfect test case for the kind of work I've been doing. Can these grand long-term geographical theories, do they actually help you understand what happened on June the 23rd, 2016 in one nation state? And so, obviously, I came to the answer, yes, they do. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written this book. But it just seemed like a perfect opportunity to think about this question, as you say, the role of the individual, the role of culture, the role of institutions in effecting change, and how the individual and the institutions fit in between the vast impersonal forces and the very important persons like the Genghis Khans.
So what power did kings actually have then? Because, from reading your book and reading other books, it seems like kings often didn't have even a say of who they married, not necessarily which religion they had, even which battles they fought. So even the kings themselves seemed to have to, balance the interests of their subjects and, fight off people who had equal power to themselves. So what, was it good to be king, or was it terrible?
Well, you will be shocked to hear. I think the answer is, well, it depends. It depends very much on who you are and when you live and so on. But the general conclusion I came to is that the title of the book, Geography is Destiny. So geography is destiny, but it's up to us to decide what to do with that destiny. And I think this is very much the case in the larger British story. That say you look at something like, say, the English Reformation in the 16th century, when Henry VIII takes England out of the Catholic, this sort of European Union that the Catholic Church has created based on the continent. Henry VIII takes England out of that gradually during the 1530s. And, as most people know, it's the proximate cause, the immediate cause for this is he needs to get a divorce from his first wife so he can marry this hottie Anne Boleyn, who's younger and is going to give him babies and secure the line and everything. And of course, he's just obsessed with the woman, with Anne Boleyn as well. So he really wants to get this done. Pope won't let him do it. So he ends up taking England out of the Catholic Church so that he can get his divorce. However, the obvious question here is, well, so what would have happened if we'd had somebody else as king in England in the 1530s? Would this not have happened? And it's a very good chance it wouldn't have happened because, of course, other kings were not Henry VIII. I mean, Henry VIII was completely mad. I mean, this was a bizarre guy. Other kings would not have got themselves into that sort of trouble. But you look around Europe in the 1530s, it's not like Henry VIII is the only guy taking people out of the Catholic European Union. The Swedes leave, most of the German states leave, Scotland leaves. All these people are leaving. And there's some really good reasons why they're leaving. And operating at slightly deeper levels, because Luther's theology is part of it. That is very attractive at the intellectual level. This idea, it's up to you. You can save your own soul. You don't have to have the Pope and a bunch of bishops saving your soul for you. You can do this. Or maybe God's already done this and you don't actually have to do anything. That's even more attractive. But money also had a huge amount to do with it. That by taking your country out of the Catholic Union, you got to steal all this money that the Catholic Church had stolen from you over the previous millennium. So there was just a lot of things going on. And again, this is what seems to happen. That the big things that happen often are driven by the decisions of the VIPs, the great men of history. But you get into it and you see, there's all these reasons why the VIPs go down this path. And often, again, going back to England leaving the Catholic Church, England leaves the Catholic Church, but then England goes back into the Catholic Church. And then England leaves the Catholic Church again. And then they almost go back in again. And then they come out even more. And then they think about going back in again. It's all these back and forth. And this is true of almost all of these turning points. Almost none of them at the time seem as fixed and certain as they seem to us when we look back from 400 or 500 years later. And I think there's a lot to learn from that about just how fluid reality is.
I guess the prime example is actually Brexit, right? Because David Cameron didn't necessarily want to leave.
No more than Henry VIII wanted to leave the church. I mean, he spent much of his life professing his allegiance to the Pope, and it clearly tore the guy in two, actually having to leave. And people have been urging him to leave, showing him how he could leave for several years before he actually did this. And the same with Cameron. I mean, Cameron did not want to leave the European Union. And I think that was kind of obvious listening to him speak in the year or so running up to what was going on. But he was trapped by problems partly of his own creation, much like Henry VIII, and kind of got backed into this.
So what's your view then, as someone who's not, for the people who are not kings, we're all kings, but for people who aren't kings, should you live for enjoyment or should you try to have impact? What's the big history advice along this direction?
Well, I think this is one of the things where economists have kind of got it right. When economics is really taking off in Europe in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, the economists, political economists as they call themselves at the time, they're scratching their heads very much about what is it all about? What should economics be trying to do? And they come up with this wonderfully abstract way of talking about what their subject matter really is. And they say what economics is about is maximizing utility. And this word utility that they sort of invent, it just means utility is just whatever appeals to you. And they say there's no way for the economist to know what is the good for the human race, what is the best thing for humanity. The way ancient philosophers like Aristotle would say that the point of life is the pursuit of to kalon, the good. Aristotle and Plato would regularly say this. And then they would write lots about what the good should be. A lot of Enlightenment philosophers in Europe, they write a lot about what the good should be and how you should live the best possible life. And the economists just sort of shrug and say, hey, we're all different, each to his own. Maybe your idea of the good is lying on a beach all day. Maybe my idea of the good is being president of the United States, which it's good that it isn't, because I wasn't born here, so I can't be. But everybody has their own idea of the good. Most of us are actually quite conflicted over the good, and we want incompatible things. The economists start saying, well, who cares? Just let people get on with choosing the good for themselves. And the theory, of course, that gets going in the 19th century is that the marketplace is the ideal institution when you don't know what people want. You don't know what their utility is. The marketplace is the ideal institution to allow people to pursue their own utility. And if you really value a fast car, then you're willing to pay a lot of money for the fast car. And I don't particularly care. I've got real old clunkers. I don't really care about fast cars. I can spend my money on completely different things. It's up to me. And I frankly think that there's no better way to think about this. And we each have our own utility. It's foolish of anybody to try to tell us what our own utility should be, what you should want out of life. So if you want to go out and change the world, knock yourself out, go out and do that. If you want to be a couch potato, who am I to tell you not to do that? But that's not something I learned from big history.
Well, the reason why I asked the question is, so right now there's various conflicts going on in the world. And for example, in Ukraine and various other places. And one of the questions I've been thinking about is, particularly when I was reading your book, you see these situations where territory just flips hands back and forth and back and forth. England will take over northern France, and then it will collapse, and then France will take over southern England. And bearing this in mind, and it almost seems like there's a certain futility in certain elements of sort of conquest and defense. And so I wonder, if you're an 18-year-old boy, 18-year-old guy, and your country's at war, and you've only got one life, under what circumstances does it make sense to actually go forward and say, look, I am going to fight for this cause. I'm going to die in this trench. When you have a personal decision, I mean, this is a very real decision for some people, and we're sitting here in sort of an academic sense asking it. But do you have some sort of is there some way of is there some perspective that you can gain on questions like this?
Yeah. Because if you're living in Ukraine, I think Ukrainians probably understand extremely well, better than most people, that geography is destiny. That the very name of the country, Ukraine, probably comes from an old Slavonic word meaning borderlands. And if you've got the choice, you do not want to live in a country called borderlands, because it means everybody is going to be fighting with you. Just the geographical location of Ukraine means that having Ukraine be your friend. It's a life and death matter if you're a ruler in Russia or in Germany or Poland or the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, the old Turkish Empire. For all of these places, having a hostile Ukraine is a really, really bad thing for your country. So Ukraine is a place that has been fought over constantly for several centuries now. And a lot of the time, this is one of the things I think we do learn from history. A lot of the time, people have just not been that bothered about this. It hasn't bothered them all that much. It's not kind of offended against their utility. If you're a Ukrainian nobleman, having a ruler who lives in Moscow or a ruler who lives in Constantinople, it's not that big of a deal through a lot of history. We see this over and over again. Ukrainians have not been particularly bothered about fighting back against other people trying to take them over. But in the modern world is just a very, very different sort of place. Ukrainians have had terrible experiences under Soviet rule, and they do not want to go back there again. In the early 1930s, millions of Ukrainians starved to death, an entirely avoidable famine. That Stalin, if he didn't actually encourage the famine, then he at the very least completely turned a blind eye to it. He was quite happy to see those Ukrainians die. So Ukrainians can be easily understood. Ukrainians do not want to go back under Russian rule. And Ukraine, obviously, as an independent country, is a relatively recent invention. And a lot of the time when rulers say things which sound ridiculous, like when Putin says this stuff about Ukraine not being a real country, often it's built on something that does make sense, but then it's been spun and taken off in this very self-serving direction. Geographically, Ukraine is really two separate countries. So there's northern, fairly wooded area, and a southern, very steppe, flat, dry area. And historically, they've been two very distinct places. They get kind of bundled together more by the Russians than by anybody else back in the 18th century. And so it's a relatively recent invention that Ukraine is a country of its own. But in the current geopolitical context, it matters very, very much to many, many Ukrainians that they not fall back under Russian control. And it's something that very clearly a lot of Ukrainians, when this invasion happened, they say, this is something we cannot live with this. If it means I die, then I die. I'm going to risk my own life because this matters so much to me. And I think we all know from looking around the world, one of the problems the United States has had in waging its proxy wars over the last 30 years is, over the last 50 years, is that we don't always find people who feel that way. When we say when the US got heavily involved in South Vietnam, found itself in a country where, from the American perspective, not enough South Vietnamese felt the way the Ukrainians do about dealing with invasions from North Vietnam. Way too many for the American interests, way too many South Vietnamese were saying, well, okay, so we get taken over by a communist government run from Hanoi. Is that really so much worse than being run by a completely corrupt capitalist government in Saigon? And a lot of people saying, well, no, maybe it's actually better. And so the South Vietnamese don't behave like the Ukrainians because they're operating under a completely different set of pressures, feel very differently about something like patriotism, sovereignty, identity, very different factors to them. So I think this is one reason why within a single country, you can get some people who would happily lay down their lives for their country. In fact, that's one of the most wonderful things they could think of for their lives, is to lose their life in the service of their country. And then other people who just cannot understand how anybody could feel that way.
From a geopolitical context, the current situation that we have now, should small countries who are worried about their sovereignty aid Ukraine for that reason? As in, if you're interested in your own sovereignty, then you presumably want stability in the world and so that borders remain fixed. And so is it in the interests of small African states, Australia, and smaller nations to actually back the smaller side here?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the big problems for any political leader. And political scientists think about this by saying there's basically two ways to deal with big bully countries like Russia. And one of them they call bandwagoning, and the other they call balancing. And the bandwagoning approach is you look at the big bully on the block and you say, okay, I'm really scared of Vladimir Putin. Or actually, a better example still would be Adolf Hitler in 1930s in Europe. Countries in Eastern Europe, small countries, say, I'm really scared of Hitler. He is perfectly capable of invading our country and doing terrible things to us. I look around and I don't see much chance for our country if Hitler decides he wants to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bandwagon. I'm going to make nice with Hitler. I'm going to find out what he wants. I'm going to kind of cut a deal with Hitler. Because my assumption will be that Hitler is looking at my country, looking at Romania or Czechoslovakia or whatever it might be, looking at my country and saying, I want things from them. I can get everything I want by invading them, but invading is really expensive. It's going to cost a lot of lives, a lot of money. It might not go well, as Putin is finding out. So if the rulers of Czechoslovakia come to me, say, hey, let's make a deal. We will offer you 2/3 of what you want, but it's worthwhile for you to take that 2/3 and not invade us, because invading us would cost more than that other third. So take this deal. And if you can hash out a deal like that, then bandwagoning is often the smart move for the small countries to make. Other times, though, you look at the situation and you think about, well, what's it going to entail for the country if we have Hitler come in? It's going to be horrendous. We don't want that. And we look around and we actually do see some credible allies out there, like Britain, France, Russia, Soviet Union. Maybe we think these are credible allies. And in that case, what we should do is balance against Hitler. And we can put together a coalition of all the little countries and combine. Individually, we're much weaker than Hitler, but combined, we've got the strength to balance out Hitler. And Hitler will look around and say, okay, I'm going to back off from this whole invading thing. It doesn't look like it's going to go well, so I'm just not going to do it. And so in the 2020s, Because what Vladimir Putin wants to do is spread the idea that balancing is not a good idea, that everyone should bandwagon with him. Whereas what Joe Biden wants to do, of course, is spread the idea that balancing is the way to go. If we all stick together, we can scare Putin to the point that he's not going to do this sort of thing anymore. And we see it very vividly, actually, with China in the West Pacific, that China is really, really keen never to negotiate with groups like ASEAN or any of the other alliances in East Asia. They always want to have bilateral negotiations. So China sits down with Vietnam or Thailand. China is so much bigger than Vietnam or Thailand. And China can bully them and cut a deal with them, but get most of what it wants all the time without having to use force. If they have to sit down with the whole of ASEAN or the whole of some Trans-Pacific Partnership or something, that's going to go much less well for China. So this is one of these sort of, at least the political scientists like to say, this is one of these eternal strategic factors, the relative weight of balancing and bandwagoning. And if you're going to be successful as an aggressive dictator, you want to persuade everybody that they should bandwagon. If you want to stop the dictators, you want to persuade everybody they should balance. I think this is the diplomatic struggle going on at the moment.
Do you think these two mechanisms will eventually lead to just larger and larger and larger blocks until we eventually have, the America bloc, the Europe bloc, the Asia bloc, and maybe the African bloc or the Middle Eastern bloc? Is this sort of inevitable that our federated states are going to get larger and larger and larger?
I guess I would say not inevitable. I mean, nothing. Pretty much nothing in history is inevitable. We've always got choices. It's just that sometimes the odds are stacked so heavily in favor of one option that it may as well be that you have no choice. And what we see over the long run, we see cycles in this of consolidation and fragmentation. And the long-term trend has definitely been toward consolidation. The states and the alliances, and particularly the economic and intellectual and religious systems in the world today, are so much bigger than they were in the past. So the long-term trend pretty clearly has been toward consolidation. But that goes along with lots of fluctuations, and it can be consolidating in certain ways, and yet in other ways we've got more separate nation-state governments today in the world than at any time in history, and yet they function as these great big blocks. So it goes in these cycles, and so you'll get periods when, say, you look at ancient history. The Mediterranean basin. You go through this cycle about 2,000 years ago where more and more of it is pulled together by the Romans, largely through conquest, but partly through diplomacy and negotiation. And leaders of independent groups saying, hey, the Romans are offering you this deal. And the deal is, you make nice with me and you can maybe formally become part of my empire, or probably not. Probably we'll just have you as a client king, and you make nice and we will give you all this stuff, and you get to come to Rome and hang out and drink wine and wear a toga and go to the baths, and it's all really great. And you get to be part of this sort of global, like sort of Davos man kind of global set, and hang out with these people. And this appeals a lot to a lot of the top people in Europe 2,000 years ago. They want to be Roman. They want to be part of this Roman Empire. They're not necessarily everybody feels this way, but a lot of them want to be, and they sort of drift into the Roman orbit. But then they often find it's actually not as great as they thought it was. And there's these forces pulling them away from it as well. And with the British story, we see this happening very clearly about 2,000 years ago. But then at some points, the forces are more centrifugal. Like, say, by the time you get to the 4th and especially the 5th century CE, there's all these reasons now why people in regions that have been taken into the empire are starting to say, I don't really think the empire is working for us anymore. And for all sorts of reasons, the emperor at the center is less able to provide the services that he claims to be offering for people on the periphery. And one of the biggest ones is security. That the ancient world is a rough place, and people are constantly stealing stuff from each other. And one of the parts of the deal the Romans offer is, we provide security. We have this frontier. If you're on our side of the frontier, we will protect you against raids from the outside, and bad stuff won't happen to you. Well, people are finding that's not true anymore. And raiders are coming in all the time. We're paying all these taxes to Rome. And yet Something bad happens, nobody comes to help us. Wouldn't it make more sense? You get the big men on the frontier, the local bishops and the local lords saying, wouldn't it make more sense, instead of paying these taxes to Rome, is you just pay the taxes to me, and I keep the taxes here in my castle, and I will organize a local defense force. And sure, it's not as good as a Roman legion, nowhere near as good, but it's here. And something bad happens, and these guys can have their pitchforks and be out there within a couple of hours, whereas it's going to be months before anybody comes from the Roman Empire, if they come at all. And the further people agree to this, the further people get drawn into this, the less money flows to the center of the empire, the less able the emperor is to provide the services. So you get this downward spiral. Fragmentation begins to spread. People start saying, yeah, this whole Roman Empire thing, it stinks. It doesn't work for us. So we don't want their horrible baths anymore. We don't want to feel Roman anymore because it doesn't work for us. And so you go through these cycles that are up and down with all kinds of different things feed into the process, which is what makes the history so complicated. But it's actually a rather simple dynamic underlying it. Of basically, where do people see the best options for themselves? What is their utility in these frontier situations?
One of the things that interests me is I understand sort of roughly how it is that states use hard power to grow. So as you said, Rome offered protection to various groups, and so it was beneficial to be part of the Roman Empire. But what I don't understand so well is how you can have soft power entities, like the Catholic Church, for example. So I don't understand how the Catholic Church grew to the point where it could excommunicate kings and where it could what was the benefit to the first movers when the church was still small? Why would you join this entity at the outset?
Yeah, well, like all institutions, the church changes enormously over time. So that by the time you get, say, to the 13th century, when you've got popes like Innocent III, who can actually bring the King of England, King Stephen, can bring the King of England to his, King John, can bring the King of England to his knees by just saying, I'm going to excommunicate you. That is a very different situation from these first movers that you're talking about. And the first movers for the Catholic Church, like say, well, I was sticking with the English case again. First movers for the Catholic Church, they come into England while it's still part of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. But then when the Roman Empire in England collapses in the 5th century, Christianity more or less dies out in what had been the old Roman province of Britannia. And it has to be reintroduced. So in 597, almost 200 years after Britannia tumbled out of the Roman Empire, this Roman Italian monk, Augustine, shows up in southern England, and he's brought the good word with him. He's going to convert the English. And he gets there and starts talking to people. And this is a pretty bloodthirsty lot of guys he's talking to, these early Anglo-Saxon kings. They are really, really violent people. But he wins them over to the Catholic Church. And what he's offering them is, again, it's a deal. A negotiation goes on. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, when Anglo-Saxons are moving into England, they set up these very, very small kind of chiefdoms more than kingdoms. There's dozens of these things in England, very, very, all of them very, very tiny. And then they all set about fighting each other, trying to emerge as the top dog and turn yourself from a chief into a big king. And this is difficult because you're beating up your neighbors and then trying to kill their chief and then persuade them that you should become their chief. You have to persuade them to accept you as their chief. It's very difficult to do that because you've always got all these local families with long roots in the area fighting against you. And so these guys, these chiefs, they're all looking around for some edge over the neighboring chief. And here comes this guy, Augustine. And what Augustine is saying, behold, I have good news. The Lord has spoken to us. And what the Lord says is there is eternal life for everybody who will accept this Catholic Church. And that's sort of good news in itself. That can win over quite a lot of people, the idea of eternal life for your soul. But even better, says Augustine, God appoints kings over us. And if God has appointed a king over you, if you want eternal life, you've got to be a good Christian. Part of being a good Christian is accepting the kings that God has appointed to rule over you. And if you, the local chief, like down in Kent, which is where Augustine shows up first of all, if you, the local chief, accept Jesus Christ as your savior, you get the backing of the biggest, richest, and most coherent institution in Europe at this point. You get the backing of the church. And we start telling everybody that if they mess with you, they're messing with God. Messing with you, it's not treason, it's not a political crime. It's a crime against the entire cosmic order. Messing with you threatens to bring down the entire universe. Don't do that. It's really, really bad. Plus, to give a little more oomph to this message of don't mess with the king whom the Lord has appointed over you, if you become a Catholic king, you now have access to all these conferences of other Catholic kings. You now have access to the daughters of all the Catholic kings. You can marry them, which you can't do if you're a pagan. You can marry into the royal family of France, which is so much more powerful than anybody in England. Has all this wealth, all this sophistication, all this charisma, all these things that can impress people. You potentially get to draw on their military might. You also get to draw on the institutional powers of the church. And at the end of the 6th century in England, very few people can read and write. But if you want to be a powerful king, you've got to have tax systems. You've got to tax people. You've got to keep records. Mm-hmm. The church provides you with monks who can read and write, who set up schools in your kingdom to teach more people to read and write. And you can have all of this if you just accept Jesus as your savior, with a couple more details attached to it. There's always strings, a couple more strings attached to it. One of the strings is you must set up the church in your kingdom. So that means you've got to hand over a lot of property to us within your kingdom. You're surrendering some of your sovereignty to us, the Catholic Church, in return for which you get this grander sovereignty as part of the Catholic Church. And we surrender some of your identity to us because you're no longer just Kentish, you're now Christian as well. And so we, the church, get to tell your people some of what they can and cannot do. And you surrender control over your top guys because your lords and knights and so on will now become part of the Catholic Church. So we, the church, begin to exercise control over them. It's like you're handing over parts of your kingdom to Italians. But in return, we're offering you this deal. And as long as you think the deal is a good deal, then you will want to join the church. And it's like, it's very like the balancing and bandwagoning. The more chiefs who decide to become Christian kings, the more difficult it becomes for other chiefs to stay out of the organization. And once it begins to start rolling, you get this just tidal wave of Christianity running through the ruling classes in the old province of Britannia. And within the space of a century, within a century of Augustine coming, all of them have become Christians. And that's not the end of the story. There's a whole lot more goes on as well. But it's all about making a deal. And once the deal has succeeded, then the soft power has enormous clout, and going against the church starts to become this very, very difficult thing. But early on, the church has got to be constantly negotiating, constantly cutting these deals with these kings.
So it was quite sly, actually.
You can look at it in that way. And of course, this is the thing you've got to remember. It's very tempting for historians to get into the very cynical side of this, because some of these guys really were cynical. Extremely cynical. The famous Sutton Hoo ship burial in England, probably from the 630s, is this King Raedwald of East Anglia, who was an Anglo-Saxon king who was sort of Christian. And so he goes to his grave, though. And in his grave, there's all this very Christian stuff. He has christening spoons in there, inscribed with the names of Saul and Paul, the two different names of St. Paul. A lot of Christian imagery in there. And yet it's also full of weapons. And it's surrounded by what look suspiciously like human sacrifices. And it's very much like Raedwald. Well, if we didn't know who it was, we might say, oh, Raedwald was just a little confused over the finer details of this Christianity thing. Like, a lot of kings have been over the ages, a little confused. But we actually have an account of Raedwald in the Venerable Bede's history of the English Church, when he says, Raedwald, he was like a real flip-flop guy. 1 minute he's a good a Christian as you can get, next minute he's not Christian at all. He's playing both sides against each other. So it's easy to be cynical about these guys, and often it's right to be cynical. But I think what we sometimes forget, because so many historians in the modern world are not particularly religious people, we often forget that people really did believe this stuff. And yes, they're cynical, but they are deep believers as well. Like, I mean, a lot of these early Anglo-Saxon guys who are embracing the faith and joining the Catholic Church, they do something which is absolutely not in their own interest. You can say it's in the interest of the ruling family going down the road, but not in their own interest. They renounce their thrones. They get accepted by the church and say that you are anointed. You are now a Christian king. Anyone who messes with you is messing with God. And they say, oh, great, that is so fantastic that I'm going to give up my throne. And I'm going to become a monk, and I'm going to go and live in a monastery somewhere. And I'm going to learn to read and write, because hardly any of these guys can read. Learn to read and write, and I'm going to spend the rest of my days copying out the Bible. That is my utility. That is what I really, really want. And that is good for the royal family. And because having a really holy guy as former king is really good for you. That's one of the top things you've got to advertise the piety of your royal family. But it's not so good for the guy himself. He ceases to be king. His son takes over. He ceases to be king. And maybe some of these guys are so in love with their sons that they will give up their own power willingly. But, on balance, that has not been the pattern for kings through the ages. They tend to want to kill their sons rather than love them. And so, I think you have to accept that people really did believe this message. It's not just cynicism.
So did the church put a cap on how powerful you could become? Because it's got to balance the power of all the different nation states, right? So does it say, now France, you are becoming way too powerful, and so I'm going to crush you? They don't want any one nation to become as powerful as the institution itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the power of the Pope and the power of the kings are two very different things. And there is often a lot for the Pope to get by seeing really friendly kings become really powerful, because they can do things for him. It's like the Pope, if the Pope needs to have somebody crushed, the Pope can't militarily crush people himself. He's got to get somebody else to do that for him. So it's like, again, a very common kind of problem that political scientists spend a lot of time worrying about. Is like, they call it the principal agent problem. That if you are the guy in charge, you're the Pope, the principal, who by definition, you're the guy in charge because God says so. You need to get things done. But if you are the Pope or the CEO of a big corporation or whatever, you can't actually do all the things that need to get done. You have to delegate power to agents who work for you. And you've got to delegate enough power that the agents can actually do what you want, but not so much power that the agents can start standing against you. And this is a particular problem for the Pope when his kind of power, like the power to move people's consciences and to get them to want what the Pope wants, which is a classic definition of soft power, very different from the power of the King of France or the King of England. So again, constant negotiations back and forth. So like when King John in England in the early 13th century really annoys the Pope, Pope wants to get rid of him, but the Pope can't actually do that himself. But by excommunicating King John, the Pope is sending out a message saying, all of the barons in England who are tied to King John by these oaths of loyalty, well, your oaths of loyalty are now dissolved because John is outside the church, and these oaths of loyalty are guaranteed by God. So when John is outside the church, the oaths don't work anymore. So you are now perfectly free to go kill King John. God isn't going to make a peep about that if you go kill King John, or at least depose King John. And he can say to the King of France, if you want to invade England, because all these kings are intermarried, they've all got claims on each other's thrones, you want to invade England, you're going to find that I, the Pope, will smile very favorably on your claim to the throne of England. So you might want to think about that. And so the Pope is, again, he's always maneuvering. He doesn't want to see these kings get too powerful, as you say, because then the stronger they get, the more difficult they are to influence to do things for you. But they can't get too weak either, because then nobody's going to get anything done for you. So yeah, it's a difficult job being Pope. And actually what makes the Pope job really difficult, and in this regard different from being CEO, is like nobody is ever going to say that a CEO should be voted out of office because he or she has made too much money for the company. This is bad. We're too rich now. We don't like that. That's not going to happen. But if you're Pope, your power comes from being the emissary of a man who owned nothing and died a horrible death to save others. And if you are the richest man on the planet, that is kind of difficult to square with vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And of course, a lot of these popes were not too chaste either. Very difficult to fit these different things together. And basically, the more successful you are as a pope at manipulating kings to work for you, the more difficult it becomes to convince anybody that you actually are righteous and worth following. And so it's a really difficult job to be pope.
Is this initially how the cracks started to form and the institution fell? Like, what was the... So if that's how it builds up, what collapses it?
Yeah, it goes through cycles. And again, I keep saying this, but that's because that does happen. It goes through cycles, and each cycle is different from each other cycle, different forces involved. But each time it's the same basic underlying premise, that the perpetual problem of soft power, that the more soft power succeeds, the more it undermines itself by turning into hard power. And so, you get these regular crises of the church, and sometimes they solve them very successfully, sometimes they don't. And it's sort of built into the church, really, that you as Pope or as a really powerful bishop, you make the church run by persuading kings and barons that they need to buy into this organization in order to save their eternal souls, and also that it's got all these perks and benefits for them, buying into the organization. And when they buy into the organization, lands changes hands, castles change hands, the church takes over lots and lots of stuff. But the church can't actually run a lot of this stuff because it's church. It's just not able to do this stuff. And so the only way you can run a lot of the stuff you get from a king is by putting local people in charge for you. And so you will bring in the younger sons of local lords, bring them into the church, make them bishops or whatever, and put them in charge of things, because that is the only way to make this operation run. The problem is, a lot of these younger sons of barons are not educated kids. They are wild, bloodthirsty sex maniacs who are drunk all the time. And people are constantly complaining about it. And there's this one story that gets repeated a lot in the English sources, that you get bishops in the church who can't tell the difference between Jesus's brother Jude and Judas Iscariot, who betrays Jesus. They don't know the difference between these two guys. And yet these are the people who are being put in charge of, of dealing with the fate of Englishmen' eternal souls. So this is a real problem for the church. They're constantly getting cries to renew the church and cleanse the church. And a lot of the skill in being Pope is how you deal with these challenges and threats, because the popes themselves are very vulnerable to these challenges, because the popes tend to be the younger sons of noblemen in the city of Rome who get put on the papal throne because it's a good way for a local powerful family to control the church. And so the popes themselves are not above criticism. So they're very worried about reform movements. But on the other hand, reform movements can be very good for the church, because they can sometimes allow you to remove powerful local bishops who don't want to do what you want, and put in continental people who are more under your thumb. And so it's like so many examples of this sort of thing throughout history. It's a challenge that you can turn it into an opportunity if you're Pope, if you're really, really good at this. And sometimes it works really well for the church, like in the 10th century, in the run-up to the year 1000, there's a kind of Y1K crisis. And some of you are going to be old enough to remember the Y2K crisis in 1999, this great anxiety that all the computers in the world, their clocks have only got 2 digits for the year on their calendars. And so when we come up to December 31st, 1999, when we hit midnight, the clock's all going to reset to a row of zeros, and all the computer systems in the world are going to crash, which turned out to be a minor problem that could be fixed very, very easily. Because something a bit like this in the Catholic Church, we're coming up to December 31st, 999. When it gets to be midnight, Jesus is going to come back. The second coming is going to happen at the millennium, which is why we talk about extreme religious cults being millenarian, because this idea that the millennium, everything resets. And so this idea gets really widespread. And so you get this huge push. We've got to reform the church before Jesus shows up. And Jesus is going to look around. And he's going to see all these dudes we put into these top bishop positions say, this was not what I had in mind. And Jesus is going to be very angry about this. So we've got to reform the church before midnight on December 31st. And so you get this wave of church reform going on, and these intense struggles within all the Catholic countries to get control of the reform movement. And generally, the popes do really well at that. But then 300 years later, when you're getting another wave of this stuff, they handle it much worse. And you start to get fragmentation of the church and a much more national kinds of church just developing. So yeah, again, it's really difficult to be pope.
Is this... Was this the movements of Martin Luther and these guys? What was the one question I've always had is, and one thing I really want to understand, so maybe you can sort of explain this to me, is was it important that the Bible remain in Latin in order for the Pope to maintain his power? Once the book became available, it sounds like they wanted to educate people, but only to a certain level. Why was it important that the sort of lower classes, the peasants, didn't have access to the Word of God in such a way that they themselves could read it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, it's actually not that important. Latin is a liturgical language because the church is the Roman Catholic Church. And by being able to read and speak Latin, you belong to an international set. So it's a bit like being an English speaker in the world today. If you want to be a really successful businessman in India or China or whatever, it really helps if you can speak English and go to Davos and hobnob with all the other English-speaking guys. So very much like that in the church. And there's not much pressure for centuries and centuries, not much pressure to keep the Bible in Latin. It's more of a question of why would anybody bother to translate it? Because if being literate means being able to read Latin, that's really what it means. There's very, very few people out there who are literate in Anglo-Saxon but not Latin. You don't do that. It's kind of pointless because everything's being done in Latin at the top levels. So the church, the Bible being in Latin only becomes an issue when you start getting more people able to read it. And so you get this big push starting well before Martin Luther, really a couple of 100 years before Luther, toward some people saying, the church is corrupt, the church is not working very well for us anymore. So what we need is to educate a lot of people who can read English and put the Bible into English as well. And you're seeing similar things in France and Spain and other countries too. And there are actually a few forerunners of this much, much earlier. King Alfred the Great in England back in the late end of the 9th century. He is like centuries ahead of his time. He's fighting this life and death struggle with the Vikings. And he says, one of the big things I've got to do is make concrete a sense of Englishness against this Viking threat. And the way I see to do this is to reinvent myself as a new kind of Christian king. And to reinvent the English people as a new kind of Christian people. I want to institute mass literacy in English, and I will translate the Bible into English and translate the great works of the Church Fathers into English, and I will actually do this myself, not just rely on other people. I'm going to do this myself. This is how seriously I take it. And this, part of this thing I was mentioning earlier about these guys really did believe in this. They were very cynical and manipulative, but they really, really believed in what they were doing too. And so Alfred studies to read and write with the top people in Europe, the top teachers in Europe. He starts translating the Bible and other things into English, starts pushing mass literacy. And the Pope has zero problems with this, because this is in no way a threat to papal sovereignty or to Alfred's identity as a Catholic king. It's only when you get into this very changed world in the 14th, 15th centuries that popes start worrying seriously about vernacular Bibles and people are able to read the Bible in their own language. And all of a sudden, pushing mass literacy then, it starts to have a very different set of political implications from what it had back in Alfred's day. So again, a lot of these things, it depends on the context.
I see. This is sort of, I want to switch focus to geography, and this has sort of reminded me of a particular thing I want to ask about, which is, so to start with, by geography, you don't mean mountains and rivers necessarily. You mean a more abstract notion for geography, right? Which depends on the technology and the social structures that are in play at the time. How should I think of geography in this big historical way?
Yeah, well, geography drives history. And in a sense, I think everybody knows that. Geography drives history. But the reason that history comes out of that process in such a complicated way is that while geography drives history, history drives what geography means. And so the geography of the British Isles or Australia or Tibet or any part of the world you want to look at, the geography, the physical geography hasn't changed all that much over the last few thousand years since the water stopped rising at the end of the Ice Age and the rivers sort of settled down a little bit. Hasn't changed all that much. But what it means for the people who live there has changed out of all recognition. And this, I think, this is the secret to understanding the British story, that there's sort of two basic geographical facts in British history. And one is the fact that after the waters rose, about 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, after the waters rose, the British Isles become islands. Before that, they haven't been islands. They've been part of the European mainland because so much water is locked up in the glaciers that the sea level is like 100 meters lower than it is now. So the British Isles obviously are islands. And this is one of the fundamental facts of British geography and history. The other fundamental fact is that the British Isles are extremely close to the European continent, 34 kilometers away, really, really close. And so, in a sense, British history, 10,000 years of it, it's been this back and forth between the importance of insularity and the importance of proximity to the continent. And these keep changing their meanings. And the meanings are driven largely by the level of technology that's in use and the kinds of organization that are in use, that are themselves driven by the geography, but then feed back into the geography. And, British history, really complicated thing. Thousands and thousands of books have been written about it. But it actually breaks down to three very simple phases, which are driven by the geography and the meanings of geography. And the first of these phases, which lasts right up until just 500 years ago, Britain, the British Isles, even though they're islands, they are basically still part of the continent. The English Channel is more of a highway than a barrier. And this is because the levels of technology allow people to cross the English Channel, but they don't allow anybody to put ships into the channel and close the channel down. Controlling the seas in the sense that modern strategists talk about it, denying the use of the sea to somebody, that is just not possible before 500 years ago, because there are no ships that can do that. You can't blockade an enemy fleet in its harbour or anything. Plus, you don't have governments able to raise the funding that would pay for that sort of fleet. Technology and organisation mean that British Isles' proximity to Europe always trump its insularity, because the English Channel functions like a highway. Anyone who gets to the continental side can get over to the British side and the reverse as well. So it's its highway. Then about 500 years ago, that changes dramatically. You start to get new ships, galleons in particular, that really can stay at sea for months and months and months. If you have a fleet of galleons, you can blockade an enemy in his harbour. He can't get out to threaten the British Isles. You can cut Britain off from the continent if you want to do that. But only if you also have governments that can raise the money to build lots and lots of these ships and keep them at sea for years and years. And in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, this begins to become a possibility. It becomes possible, if you want to do it, to take Britain out of Europe. But the question is, do we want to do this? And this is really the big question that drives all of the instability, all of the violence in Britain in the 17th century, the civil wars that get fought, this argument over just who do we think we are? Where do we think we fit into Europe? Are we part of Europe or are we not? And ultimately, governments in London decide we want to be able to step outside of Europe whenever we feel the need to do this. We were going to turn the English Channel into a barrier, not a highway. And it's not a coincidence that the first person on record to talk about doing this is William Shakespeare. He writes this stuff about England being this blessed plot, the English Channel being a moat defensive, which cuts us off from the continent. And the reason nobody's writing, this is in the 1590s, and the reason nobody's doing that in the 1490s or 1390s was that it just made no sense back in the 14 and 1390s. But it did make sense by the 1590s. So the English turn the English Channel into a barrier, secure behind their moat defensive. They convert the whole of the British Isles for the first time into a single kingdom ruled from London. And they go on to create an intercontinental empire on which the sun never sets. And this only becomes possible because the new kinds of technology and organization have changed what geography means. And so for about 200 years, Britain is able to bestride the globe in a way that was just impossible at any earlier time. But the geography now does make this possible if the British want to do that. But then by about 1900, after about 200 years of doing this, the same forces of changing geography and organization that have made it possible to do this start making it impossible to do this again. The world carries on shrinking, basically, and new great mountains of money arise in Europe and Germany in particular, and in North America even more so. And to maintain its position, Britain has got to prevent the Germans from breaking down the moat defensive and drawing Britain back into the continent. But ultimately, the only way they're able to prevent that from happening is by putting themselves under the wings of the Americans, who fund the struggles against the Germans. And so by 1945, the whole moat defensive thing has become nonsense. And Britain's proximity to Europe trumps its insularity. In fact, Britain's proximity to everywhere trumps its insularity. In a world of ICBMs and jet aircraft and eventually the internet and all these other things, everybody is proximate to everybody else, which changes the meanings of geography once again. And we then see the rise of this East Asian mountain of money. And one of the lines I quote twice, in fact, in my book, because I like it so much, Lee Kuan Yew, the president of Singapore, said about a decade ago, he said, China, the rise of China is not just another big player. China is the biggest player in the history of the world. And the world is just going to have to find a new balance. And I would say that the British, since 1945, have been trying to find a new part for themselves on this global stage where geography has changed its meaning. But since about 2000, everybody in the world is having to find a new part for themselves on a new stage that changes meaning once again because of the rise of China. So it's like geography has entirely driven this story, but what the geography means keeps changing. And all the time, the actors in the story are confronted with this question of what do we want to do about the new meanings of geography? Can we identify what they are? And are we willing to take the steps that would allow us to maximize, get the best for ourselves out of the new meanings of geography?
The reason why I jumped into this question from talking about the Bible was because I like this idea that different social structures and technology can build and tear down barriers. And so I have this idea that there's the Pope, or this conduit to God, and the peasantry only really have access to God and to the Pope via the local emissaries, right? Mm-hmm. The people who can speak Latin. And then all of a sudden you invent the printing press, and you have these books that are written in the local languages, and all of a sudden you have this very direct connection to God for the individual peasants, right? So you break down this physical barrier. This is how I imagine it in my head. And I wanted to draw a parallel with what's currently happening now with the internet, because I can read Trump's toilet texts. What does this sort of proximity do to sovereignty and identity and power in the world? Like, how important is it that I can, read his tweets, and what is the exchange that's going on? What is he giving up in order to obtain in terms of your language of identity, sovereignty, and so on?
Good question. I don't really have an answer for you on that one.
Yeah, that's not in the book.
No, that's an interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that. Yeah, you'll have to have me back on the podcast next year, and I can talk about that with you.
Well, then more generally, if you don't have an answer to that, then what does the internet and ICBMs and fast transport and us exploring space, what does that do to does physical geography matter anymore, or is the main thing, does it matter that England has the channel blocking it from Europe anymore, or is that's out of date geography?
Old thinking. Well, actually, this maybe in a way sort of is a response to the previous question as well. I think what the new technologies have done is accelerate what's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years anyway, which is this process of the shrinking of the world and the dissolution of barriers. And you do get people who will say geography doesn't matter anymore. That, I think, is slightly ridiculous overstatement of things. I mean, you tell that to people in Ukraine. Geography matters a great deal. It's just that it matters a lot less than it used to. And the fact that I live in California, not in Ukraine, this is still enormously important. But because what's changed now is I could get it to Ukraine. I could get on a plane and be in Ukraine by this time tomorrow, which would have just, impossible thing to imagine 100 years ago. So geography has been shrinking, and the costs of moving people and ideas around have been collapsing over the centuries, dramatically so in the last 50 years. But they have not by any means collapsed to the point where the cost is zero. And so I think that is one of the reasons why obviously guys like Donald Trump can reach around the world today, is because the costs of doing so have fallen so sharply as compared to where they were even 100 years ago. But they certainly have not fallen to zero.
I guess another way that I could have answered the question that might make it easier to answer is, because the imagery of reading someone's toilet tweets makes it different. What I could have said is, in North Korea and in China and now I suppose in Russia, the governments are putting restrictions on the internet, restrictions on what websites people can access and so on. Why do they do that? What is it that they gain from placing these restrictions? In other words, is the internet the end of kings? and or is Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk, are they just new kings in a different form? I'm asking you too many questions at once, but that's sort of the direction I'm trying to drive in.
Yeah, and I think, the internet, like everything else, the internet is a tool. It's not the end of kings. It's a tool. And there will be a struggle. We can already see the struggle going on. Struggle between different interest groups over what you can do with this tool. And this is very much what happened with the printing press initially. There is the great motivation initially in Europe with the printing press is to be able to spread the Bible to more and more people. So more and more people can connect directly to the word of God without these intermediaries cutting them off from it. And because the motivation of so many of the big tech people initially was this idea that information wants to be free. And we really are changing the world for the better by driving down the costs of access to information. And the idea is not that the internet creates new information. It's just that it takes all this stuff locked up in the books in the library and makes it so much easier to access it. And people in places where you don't have big libraries, you can still access all that information so long as you have a good computer connection. So it dramatically drives down the costs of accessing information, which can be a great thing for people who are struggling against repressive social orders. And I'm sure you remember 10 years ago when the Arab Spring movements were breaking out, people being able to use social media to connect. This is one of the big forces speeding up the pushback against the rulers. And then it turns out very quickly, the rulers can also do something about this. And everything is a negotiation. Everything is a game of maneuver and counter maneuver. And the internet, it's not something that exists there out in the ether. It is a very nuts and bolts physical thing. You have big servers. If the government gets control of the servers, well, everybody can forget about their internet service. So there's a struggle going on. And it's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years already. And obviously the forms of it are different now from what they were when people were printing the first books, or first inventing the technology of writing, but it's the same struggle. So no, the internet does not mean the end of kings. It just means that kings who are slow and clumsy are going to get deposed. Ones who are adept are not going to get deposed. And we actually do see exactly this sort of struggle back in England in the 17th century over newspapers. One of the main reasons a lot of the advisors of King Charles I thought that he got overthrown and got beheaded in the end was that he was so incompetent at manipulating the press.
Really?
Yeah, and he was really incompetent at it. His successors were much, much better at it.
Do you think there's ever going to be a country which is completely disconnected from physical geography? So, for example, just an internet-based country, for example. Is this what companies are? Should we think of companies as we used to think of, big organizations like Facebook and so on?
Yeah, I would say if it's disconnected from geographical reality, it isn't a country anymore. So it will be just a different kind of institution. Like, say, the nation states that almost everybody now lives within a nation state. A place where it has borders that you can drive to and say, this is the border. Here is the physical border of this country. And within this country, we are all French, or we are all Australian, or whatever it might be. We have a shared identity. This is the idea behind this country. And this shared identity, sometimes we'll say it goes back to some sort of ethnic unity. We are all, nationalists tend to be very fond of this. We are all descendants of the same people. Immigrants to our country are not really British or Australian or French or whatever. We should get rid of them. And others will say, no, it's not. That's not how it works. We do have a shared identity, but it's one you can learn. You can become British or Australian by adopting our culture and so on. But still, we do all have a shared identity. That's what makes us belong to this nation state. Well, these sorts of countries, this is a very, very new thing. They only go back about 200, maybe 300 years. Before that, the idea of multinational kind of empires where your rulers will come from one area and speak one language, the nobility may be completely different, the common people are different again. Like, after the Norman conquest, for the first 200 years, English kings all spoke French first and foremost. Most of them spent more time in France than they did in England. And this was absolutely normal. These places, they were not countries like we're now used to. You go back 5,000 years, there are no states of any kind anywhere in the world. So these politico-geographical units, they're constantly changing and evolving. And one of the things that the digitization of everything might do is make national governments and nation states irrelevant. We're going to get new kinds of organizations that simply matter more. And yeah, the organizations are already there, like belonging to Facebook. This is the thing with billions of people belong to Facebook. And Facebook is not China. Facebook is not the US. It's different from those. And it cross-cuts them. It's a bit like this Catholic Church and the Anglo-Saxon kings. These organizations, they cross-cut each other. They can work for each other. They can work against each other. They can cooperate. They can fight. But they cut across each other. And one of them might ultimately supplant the other. That might not happen. So I would say one thing you can bet the house on is we're going to see entirely new forms of digitally internet-based organizations becoming more and more important. We've already seen it in our lifetimes. It's just going to accelerate. These will exist alongside nation states. And I suspect that as the world becomes more and more globalized, the digital organizations will increasingly become more important than the nation states. Although exactly how that's going to play out is anybody's guess.
From the perspective of stability, is diversity a strength or a weakness for nation states and other large organizations?
Well, this has been I would say one of the great conflicts of the 20th century was between governments that said, we now live in an industrialized fossil fuel world with all this energy, all this wealth, all this productive power. We have to reorganize our societies from the way they were back in the pre-nation state age. We've got to reorganize them, make them more coherent. And the big argument that gets going in the 19th, 20th centuries was, is the way to make a coherent nation state that will function well and compete well in the modern world, is the way to do that by eliminating difference, by making us all the same, by killing or driving away people who are different? Or is the way to make us all the same by saying all those other differences kind of don't matter? And the concrete terms say, is the way to work well, is that by being like Nazi Germany, where you say we are ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, one ruler, one people, one empire? Is that the way to make our nation? And the way to do that is to extinguish all the peoples, all the ethnic groups within it who are not German by our definition. So drive them out or we kill them all. Or is the way to do it, say, the way that the United States in particular does, is say, we're all Americans here. We can all do whatever we want to do. We all have equal opportunity here because we're all Americans. And the fact that you're Jewish and you're Muslim, sure, you're Jewish and you're Muslim, but it doesn't matter. We don't have to exterminate one of you. We just have announced that it doesn't matter. All these other differences don't matter. So old rules like saying women must stay in the home, men go out to work, doesn't matter. Open up our labour markets to women, we double the size of the labour market. That's what matters. Saying that allowing Jewish people to have seats in Congress, that brings in this whole new community that's excluded before. That matters. The fact that they're Jewish, that doesn't matter. And so you get this one trend, this sort of liberalising vision of how the state should work, saying that you can keep all the differences, but they don't matter, we're still one people. And then the other illiberal trend is saying you cannot keep the differences. We will exterminate these differences. Like say in the Soviet Union, and say men and women are biologically different, but that's as far as it goes. The women carry the babies, but that is the only difference between men and women. Men and women will work the same jobs. They'll do everything. I mean, it doesn't actually work out this way in practice, but this is what they claim. And so just two different theories about how we organize these modern states. And the wars of the 20th century, basically what they show is the liberal version is working better, at least in the 20th century. And so Germany gets defeated, Japan gets defeated, the Soviet Union ultimately collapses. And in the 21st century, because what we're seeing is a struggle between, well, does the liberal version continue to work better, or do the Chinese now have a model that is actually going to work better in the dramatically changed environment of the 21st century?
Do you suspect along similar lines that in order to stick together, the EU, for example, will need to federate and have, on the soft power side and then on the hard power side, that it will need to have a European army? Is this necessary?
Well, yeah, I think this is what we're going to be finding out, I think, in the relatively near future, that the Brexit vote was British people saying, we don't think the European Union really works. It's not providing the things that it promised to us. And what we've given up to be part of the European Union just wasn't worth it. That insularity, in fact, does trump our proximity to Europe. Whereas a lot of people in Europe are saying, of course, the opposite of that. And the European Union, it was this very, very bold experiment to see if you could merge together a lot of the sovereignty and identity of people in Europe without using violence to force people to give up anything. This was this bold experiment. And right after the Second World War, this was a tremendously attractive experiment to a lot of people. I mean, pretty much everyone agreed we cannot go back to World War II. We can't have another one of those. So here's this new idea to how to steer Europe away from that. And I tend to think that one of the reasons it worked as well as it did, at least up till 1989, was that it was doing this in the context of the Cold War. where you've got a big, very, very scary neighbor in the Soviet Union, and you've got an American ally who is very keen to see the European Union succeed. It's a way to lower the costs of fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. If the European Union succeeds and generates all this soft power, is generally pro-American, just makes things a lot easier for the US. And so it's, again, one of these deals gets worked out. It's like American presidents had always complained, like Donald Trump complained so much, about Europeans free riding and not paying for their own defense. But in a way, this was kind of good for the US. It was cheap for the US to provide European defense and not have to worry about Europeans having big, scary armies of their own. This was actually kind of good for the US to be in this situation. But once the Cold War, the Cold War ends and the Berlin Wall comes down, that logic ceases to apply so much. And when Donald Trump said this bizarre thing about the European Union is one of our biggest foes right now, everybody was sort of saying, well, what are you talking about? This is absolutely ridiculous to say European Union is one of America's biggest enemies. And yet there was some logic to what he said. That obviously the EU is not a military rival to the United States, but in the post-Cold War world, the EU has become a commercial rival to the United States. And that was something the US could easily overlook during the Cold War. It's not as easy to overlook once the Cold War is over. And so the whole logic has changed here. The Cold War has gone away. The amount of protection the US was willing to give to the EU, that had gone down substantially. Even before Donald Trump became president, that had gone down. And I think what we're seeing now is this big negotiation going on, both between the EU and other great powers, and also within the EU, over what are we here for and what costs are we willing to pay? Do we actually need to have a common European defense force of some kind to protect us against external threats? And obviously, the way Vladimir Putin is behaving has wildly changed the calculus on that for Europeans. The way China is behaving has begun to change the calculus as well. So Europeans are trying to figure this out. The whole organization is created on the premise that it doesn't need an army. It's not that kind of organization, not an old-fashioned nation state. So it doesn't need an army. Now, a lot of people are thinking, oh boy, we have got to have some kind of defense force against the Russian threat. We've got to be able to have some kind of military force to back us up in our negotiations with China. So again, I think anyone who says they know where this is going is a fool. But I think the environment has definitely changed in ways that mean the way the EU used to operate is off the table. And a lot of people have agreed on this now. Whether that means more countries are going to vote for their own exits, I think that's one of the things that we'll find out. The EU, though, has to find a new way to operate. And I think they're very aware of this.
Is Russia in a bit of a tough spot in the sense that it's sandwiched between the EU and China, and so it's a big country, but it's not a big country. It's not, it can't stand on its own in relation to Europe and China, but it's also too big to sort of join one or the other in some sense. Do you ever see Russia joining either of these unions?
Yeah, well, I think one of the many things that history teaches you is never say never. And most countries have gone through the most astonishing flip-flops in their geostrategic partnerships over the centuries. And I say Britain, again, obviously the British example very much on my mind, having just written this book about British history. But Britain, 120 years ago, goes through extraordinary flip-flops. Like France has been Britain's traditional enemy for 500 plus years at that point. Russia has been Britain's traditional enemy for at least 100 years by this point. With the British fear that Russia was going to move into India and break up the British Empire. These are the big enemies. Germany has traditionally been a British ally because the governments in London can make alliances with governments in Germany, like they did with Frederick the Great in the 18th century, and thereby encircle the French. So they create this strategic problem for the French. And British grand strategy from about 1700 onward is based on this idea of staying out of Europe as much as possible, but creating a balance of power there through alliances with Germany and other places, so that no single European power can ever become threatening enough to undermine Britain and force Britain to concentrate on having to defend the Channel rather than extending its power over the world. So this is kind of the way the British have been seeing the world. Then in the course of about 20 years, they abruptly flip-flop. France and Russia become their new best friends. Germany becomes the great enemy. And Britain also starts building up alliances with the United States. So, of course, they fought two great wars in the 1770s and again in the early 1810s against the United States. So never say never on this sort of thing. And I think moving it forward into the current context, one of the big concerns for American strategists is that failing to defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine is going to be disastrous for all kinds of obvious reasons. But roundly defeating him in Ukraine could also be disastrous, because that's going to push him more toward China. And he's been moving toward China very clearly for several years now. And you'll remember right before the invasion, there's this meeting that Xi and Putin have where they announce that their two countries are the best friends ever. The two countries, they've got a lot of strategic interests in common. Both of them are very keen to see the United States pushed back out of Europe, out of the West Pacific, so that China and Russia gain at least veto power in their near neighborhoods. So both of them would love to see the US lose credibility in the world. Both of them, they've got kind of economic interests in common. Like Russia has a lot of fossil fuels, but no money. China has a lot of money, but no fossil fuels. It's like a marriage made in heaven in all kinds of ways. And of course, they also have geostrategic differences. And these are what the US and other Western countries are trying to play up and exaggerate to keep the two apart. But one of the fears is if Russia is defeated too brutally in Ukraine, the Russians will be more or less forced to go in with the Chinese, start building joint financial systems. This is one of the great lessons of Ukraine, of the war, has been the way American financial power, Western financial power, to shut Russia out of its markets. This has really, really hurt Russia. China is very conscious of this, and watching this happen might have made China a little bit more cautious over Taiwan, say in the short run, because the Chinese don't want to receive the sort of treatment Russia got. But in the long run, of course, any Chinese diplomat, strategist is going to say, oh, we have got to find ways to decouple China from the Western-dominated global financial system, so that when we get clobbered by the Americans and shut out of SWIFT banking and all this other stuff, well, we've got our own version now, a renminbi-based system. We don't have to rely on the West. So Russia is a great potential ally in this. So there's all these ways in which Putin getting beaten too badly could actually turn out to be a disaster for the West. And this is why Henry Kissinger at Davos recently went to Davos, even though he's 99, extraordinary man. But anyway, Kissinger says, we need to start talking. We need to start finding common ground with Putin, negotiating an end to this war. You don't think you will get a battlefield victory over Russia. You've got to negotiate a solution to the end of this war. So all these diplomatic things, they are very, very complicated. And Clausewitz, the great military theorist, he had this great line saying, every strategy reaches a culminating point beyond which it becomes counterproductive. You've got some plan, you push it really hard, it works really well, but at a certain point it starts working against itself again. So I think this is one of the big things in mind for Western strategists at the moment, is what does victory in Ukraine look like? And how do we get not just the best outcome for Ukraine, but the best outcome for the West as a whole, the one that is least likely to lead to future wars?
This reminds me, people often criticize Angela Merkel for making Germany dependent on Russia for energy. And, maybe it's easy to say in hindsight that was, a bad path to go down. But do you think that's actually, it sounds like you're hinting at that this is actually the correct path to go down, that maybe we should be thinking about, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe we should be thinking about building up the Russian economy, offering, maybe something can be put on the table that looks like, okay, you withdraw from this area and we're going to invest in this market? Or is there something along these lines that is realistic, or is it sort of naive because I don't really know the history of, people say that, okay, Russia went into Georgia, there was a conflict in Chechnya, and, you can't really trust what's going on at all. Do you think it's naive, or do you think really that we should be thinking about building up Russia and making it strong and a successful nation and stop these sort of soft wars, let's say, in the background?
Yeah, and creating peace between great powers. It's like an equation, a sort of cost-benefit equation, and you've got to do two things. One is raise the costs of aggression. So raise the costs of taking violent action against the status quo, so that a ruler like Vladimir Putin thinks, oh, okay, I want to invade Ukraine. I want to get Ukraine on my side, but I know that if I invade them, I'm going to get clobbered so hard that there is no way that the benefits from invading Ukraine will ever outweigh the costs. I'm not going to do it. So one part of the strategy is you raise the costs of violent challenges to the status quo. The other way you work is that you raise the benefits of complying with the status quo. So you've got Vladimir Putin again saying, oh, I'm thinking of invading Ukraine. However, I've got such a sweet deal going now. And I know that if I invade Ukraine, I'm going to blow that sweet deal. The Germans are going to stop buying my gas and my oil and stuff. I really don't want to do that. So tempting as it is to invade Ukraine, and maybe I even think it's going to be easy to invade Ukraine, I'm not going to do it because it's going to cost me so much in terms of lost benefits. And so regardless of what our leaders say about how they act on principle, every international negotiation always operates on both sides of the equation at once. They always do. You cannot run a system just by being so scary that nobody dares cross you, because you automatically get everybody to gang up on you that way. This is not going to last. So you've got to operate on both sides of the equation. I think the problem in Ukraine is you can't be too nice to Vladimir Putin, because then you reward the aggression. If he gets all this stuff, like a land bridge to Crimea, gets all this stuff he wants that he wasn't going to get before he invaded. So you have rewarded the aggression at that point. And that is encouraging him to repeat the process in the Baltic states and get at least some of what he wants that he is never going to get by negotiation. So you don't want to go down that path. So you can't give them too many benefits. But on the other hand, if Russia, there's been some talk about permanently weakening Russia. If we do that, we create a Russia that looks horribly like Germany in the 1920s. A country full of people who believe what Vladimir Putin says, that Russia has been betrayed and stabbed in the back by the West, and are people more willing to go along with their leaders when their leaders say, we must take violent action to reverse the status quo because the status quo does not work for us. So it's a complicated kind of process that you get into, made extra complicated in this case because Vladimir Putin, while a lot of what's happening is driven by Vladimir Putin's own personal demons and his own misreading of geopolitics back in February, not all of it is. And again, it's a bit like Henry VIII. Henry VIII takes England out of the Catholic Church largely because he wants that divorce, so he can marry Anne Boleyn. But not just because of that. There are also very sound geostrategic reasons for Henry to consider leaving the Catholic Church. Same with Vladimir Putin. Russia's position is such that every Russian ruler for the last 400 years has worried more than anything about threats from the West. Like in 1610, the Poles invade Russia and burn Moscow. In 1705, the Swedes besiege St. Petersburg. They want to burn it, but they don't actually get to do that. In 1812, Napoleon famously burns Moscow again. 1917, the Germans invade and break up Russia. 1941, they invade, almost break up the Soviet Union again. You don't have to be paranoid as a Russian ruler to think the number one threat on your agenda is the threat of the West. And this is what Vladimir Putin was talking about in 2005, when he said, the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because what that did was strip away all these republics that the Soviet Union had absorbed, like Ukraine, like the Baltic states, and all the puppet states they'd got in Eastern Europe, like Poland, East Germany, all of which gave Russia this enormous strategic depth, so that when your enemies, like Hitler, invade you, you've got hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to wear them down in. Suddenly, now you don't. Your border is right up in your face. And if you're a Russian ruler, you cannot live with hostile regimes in Ukraine or Belarus or the Baltic states. This is a life and death issue for you. You've got to have some way to get rid of these hostile states. Now, one way to do it is the way that Western Europe has dealt with potentially hostile states in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union collapse. You use your soft power. You show them things that if they become like Western Europe, they can have all this really great stuff. You can have Netflix. You can have the internet. You've got all this great stuff if you become Western European. You make the Poles and the Ukrainians want what you want. That's one way to deal with potential new geopolitical threats. Your soft power attracts them toward you. You can offer them defense through your hard power. The other way is to do what Vladimir Putin does, which is you invade them and you crush them. And what Europe should want is not Russians who are unable to see the geostrategic problems and opportunities of their country, Russians who are ignorant of geography. What you want is Russians who understand perfectly well how the world works, but pursue their goals through soft power, through trading with countries, through cultural exchanges with countries. And this is why Angela Merkel buying all that Russian natural gas, that could potentially have been a really, really good thing. It raises the benefits for Russia of observing the status quo. And under different leadership, that could have been a really good thing for the whole world to draw Russia in. You might remember back in the 2000s, American leaders, George W. Bush in particular, would say, trade with China and time is on our side. We use our soft power, we open markets to these countries, we draw them into our global systems, and these countries start to want to keep this status quo that's out there. The question is always, well, with somebody like Putin, with the way Russian politics have developed, is it just naive to think you can do that? And of course, the balance between offering benefits to countries and offering threats to them, the balance between those has to depend very much on who are we dealing with here. It's like, as the world found, offering benefits to Adolf Hitler, really bad idea. Offering benefits to some rulers, a really good idea. Potentially hostile rulers can get drawn in, become your friend, not be hostile anymore. So it's like being Pope, a very, very complicated game you're playing all the time. And often we don't know until afterwards who got it right.
One thing that I wonder about is, or that I worry about actually, is how long it's going to take for trust to be rebuilt. I imagine, let's imagine that tomorrow Russia pulls out of and goes back to the pre-2014 borders. It's going to take a long time for Ukraine to ever trust Russia again. And
yes.
So, so here's a more general question. If you look at England, for example, England is seen today as a colonial power or an ex-colonial power. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the image that England has for a lot of people. But if you look back at, again, your large history perspective, you see that there were moments in British history when Britain was the slave, or the territory now that is Britain, and then they expanded their borders. They got run over by the Normans. They expanded again. The Romans were there. The Vikings were. And so in this larger perspective, you see this back and forth. How long will it take? Will England? Will Britain always be seen as a ex-colonial power, or will this be washed out in the history? And how long is it going to take before we view it sort of in the same way that we view Rome? No one thinks of Rome as being a particularly aggressive state these days.
Yeah. The example I always think about is Denmark. Political scientists have this expression they use, getting to Denmark. And what they mean by that, when they talk about Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere, getting to Denmark means turning the country into a place with responsible government, rulers who are answerable to the people and have institutions that mostly work for the public good and are benign, and you have the rule of law, and you can rely on things working the way that we can more or less rely on working in the US or Britain or Australia or something. You've got a reasonable amount of faith the government will do what we think it should do and serve the people. Whereas in a place like Russia, you cannot rely on that sort of thing happening. So they've got this expression, getting to Denmark. But 1,000 years ago, nobody wants to get to Denmark. Denmark is where Vikings live, where the Vikings do really bad stuff to you. And the Vikings, for many centuries, nobody's trying to get to Denmark. And I would say with Denmark, it's not really until about... actually, I'm thinking in my head now, the data's moving forward and forward and forward the more I think about this. But Denmark gradually sheds its scariness. And the same with Norway and Sweden, because they're all part of the same Viking package here. They gradually shed their scariness. So they cease to be serious military powers by about 1800. So it takes about 800 years to do that. Although they've gradually been shedding it up to them. But by 1800, Sweden, the last of them to be a serious military player in Europe, it's more or less stopped by 1800. By 1900, they sort of lost the military threats, the economic threats altogether, but have not become particularly cuddly places yet. They only really become lovable, cuddly places after the Second World War. And so it's a very, very long process. And you can see it already happening in Britain. There's this wonderful book that I draw on several times in my own book by a historian named Dominic Sandbrook, and it's called The Great British Culture Factory. And it is a wonderful book full of all these wonderful stories about rock bands like Black Sabbath, one of my favorite bands, and British movies and this kind of thing. But it's basically about how the British began to make themselves lovable. And it's asking, because this is a serious question, that 100 years ago, Britain was not lovable. Britain had a certain amount of soft power in the sense, quite a lot of soft power in the sense that most, a disproportionate number of the world's great scientists, great scholars, great literary figures were British. British absolutely dominated intellectual production, way out of proportion for an island the size of the British Isles. So even now, Britain is still number 2 in the Nobel Prize rankings. Britain punches way above its weight in this kind of cultural soft power. But Britain was still basically a scary sort of place. And people predominantly thought of it, these are people who will send gunboats and kill you. This is what the British are. Now, nobody seriously thinks the British are coming to get them. But they do think the British have this sort of nasty aura around them. And yet Britain has become arguably the number 1 soft power country in the world. There's several soft power indices out there. Britain generally comes either number 1 or somewhere in the top 5. And so Sandbrook tries to explain, how did that happen? And it wasn't a conscious thing at all. It's not like governments sat down and said, we need to make ourselves the number 1 soft power. They actually do that now. And Britain's latest sort of strategic guidance document in 2021, they come and say, this is Britain's soft power is among its major assets. We need to build up its soft power. But there's actually not a lot that a government can do to make that happen. But British people, having been sort of ejected from their empire and kicked out of all their old roles as the arbiter of the world's fate, have managed to reinvent themselves as this sort of cuddly, lovable nation. And it's kind of a strange thing to think about, but like Manchester United and Harry Potter and the Spice Girls and the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. This is the modern British equivalent of things like invading Crimea in the 1850s and sending gunboats. This is what Britain does now. This is what gives Britain its potency on the world stage. So the country's changed dramatically. It's likely to be quite a long time before the taint of colonialism is just sort of forgotten about. But I think Brits won't have to wait as long as the Danish had to wait. I think the world moves a lot faster now. And we can already see this happening.
So in terms of recommendations, not from a moral perspective, we'll put morals aside, but just if you're a strategist, if you are advising a country that in the past has committed atrocities, then there's this people say that there's this path that Germany took, which is of atonement, saying sorry, and there's for example Japan, there's this sort of silence. So putting morals aside, just from a strategic position, what is the best way to go? Because both of these countries are extremely successful economically these days, and so. Is there really a difference? Is the lesson that it doesn't matter which path you take as long as you pick one? What's the lesson there?
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of different ways for countries to rehabilitate themselves, and the success of Germany and Japan. Yeah, these obviously they have something to do with the ways the countries dealt with their past, but they have, to be very brutal about it, they have a lot more to do with the Cold War. The United States, NATO, needed a strong West Germany. They needed the West German economy to be booming so that it could pay for West Germany to rearm itself, because otherwise there was simply no way to make the mathematics of having a NATO standing up to Russia in Europe. There's no way to make that work if West Germany wasn't a successful economic and military power. And with Japan, it was going to be very difficult to fight the Korean War in the early 1950s if Japan wasn't industrially successful as well. And there's also the larger concern that communism was a very powerful soft power and very powerful, potent ideology. The West needed to attract war-torn, devastated countries like West Germany and Japan, attract them toward the Western alliance, toward Western values. Seeing their economy succeed was a big way to do this. And so the West pumped money into West Germany and Japan, admitted them to their markets. So the stories of the West German and Japanese rehabilitation, they're kind of complicated. A lot was going on. And certainly what the governments did and the values they promoted, these have a part in these stories. But I would say, and maybe this just makes me a bad, cynical person, but the West Germans could have apologized all they liked till the end of time. If it hadn't been for the fact that West Germany was so important in the Cold War, they wouldn't have had anything like the recovery they did have.
I see. So then, on the topic of communist soft power, do you think? So I'm working towards. So I'm going to sort of wrap up the discussion, and I'm going to touch on a few political questions, and then after I wrap up, I want to ask you some pretty rapid questions that are sort of disconnected from the rest of the discussion. But so one question that I'm sort of curious about is: do you think communism and fascism and these sort of government systems that we sort of connect with the 20th century, do you think they needed the geography of the 20th century really to exist? Are these forms of government sort of going to peter out and disappear as we advanced in technology? Are these sort of out of date, let's say?
Yeah, I guess I would say all political ideologies will peter out and disappear as things change. Nothing has ever lasted forever. There is no reason to think that communism or fascism are going to be the first belief system in the history of the planet that lasts forever. So yes, that you can say with absolute certainty they will go away. Because what you can't say so certainly as well when and under what circumstances. That in Europe it seemed like fascism had gone away because post-war Europe just made an environment where the sort of problems that fascism was able to claim persuasively for many people, claim to be able to solve, those problems have been made to go away by the post-war economic miracles. It looked like fascism was a dead letter, except for extreme fringe groups. But because as things changed in Europe again since the fall of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, fascism is coming back. As things change, you can't change one thing without changing everything else. And sometimes when you create a new environment, it opens up spaces for old ideas to start to be successful again. Other times it shuts them down completely. So yeah, I think it would be a rash predictor who says that they know what's going to happen with fascism and communism in the short run. But yeah, in the long run, all of these political ideologies will certainly go away.
Is there a general rule that you can put down, though? So, for example, let's say, for example, in the future, we have abundance. So everyone on Earth has enough to eat. There's, everyone has all the mobility they want and so on. We have a good world moving forward. The sickness is down. People have long lives. In that sort of a world, what sort of political systems rise up? And conversely, when we have the opposite situation where everyone's really struggling to survive, are there some rules that you generally tend to see historically, or can you not put any rule down in that way?
Yeah, I suppose it would. This will depend a little bit on what exactly we mean when we're talking about a good world where there's abundance and freedom and all kinds of things that most of us think are good. Because in many ways, this is what we currently have. Or if you don't think so, then it still remains true that we have more of that now than we have ever had in the history of the world at any point in the past. So standards of living in the world globally now are dramatically higher than they've ever been before. We're having a little dog barking. It's okay. It's okay. Hold on, just wait a minute. If you could give me just a second.
No worries. So we were talking about what sort of world governments you should expect given how much abundance there is in the world.
Yeah, I think there's more abundance in the world now than there's ever been in the past, and dramatically more so. And the 20th century saw things happen that would have seemed like magic in any earlier age. So on average globally now, people earn 7 times as much as they did 100 years ago. And in the last 30 years, we've seen something like 1 billion people get lifted out of absolute poverty. Life expectancy globally has, I think, roughly doubled across the last century. Just extraordinary things have happened. And that was possible in large part because governments that were willing to engage in globalization, open their borders, allow goods and people and ideas to move back and forth. So I think one thing that you can say is a prerequisite for sustained global growth is globalization. That's a very unpopular position to take at the moment, but it just, looking at the historical pattern, it's impossible to see it any other way.
So I want to ask one final question that's connected to the interview, and then if it's okay, I want to ask you a couple of just disconnected ones. And that is, so reading your book, I really got the impression, as I said at the very beginning, that you really love the story of Britain, and you put a lot of character into the story. I really enjoyed reading it, and I guess the question that I have is maybe a sad question to end on, but do you have some sort of a sadness that you don't get to write the sequel? You don't get to see. Almost certainly, depending on how technology goes, you don't get to do the next 10,000 years. Is this something that you think about ever when you're writing a book like this?
That's an interesting question. You wonder obviously about where things are going to go, and you think actually it would be sort of nice to be able to come back in 1,000 years' time and see how things turned out. Did it go anything like what I thought it would? But sadness about not living for 10,000 years. And maybe if you'd asked me that when I was 20, I would have said, "Oh yeah, that's a real shame." And by the time you get in your 60s, you're thinking, "Yeah, I don't know about living 10,000 years."
Well, Ian Morris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me on again.
So now I get to ask you some disconnected questions. So this is the sort of
Howie.
So if they go all right, I'll just chuck them on the end of the Okay. How are you doing, by the way? Are you?
Sure, fine.
Yeah, I should actually be polite. But okay, I'm curious about the following question. So first off, can governments exist without the threat of violence?
Yeah, I guess some people would say that, yeah, by definition, governments cannot exist without the threat of violence. One of the most popular definitions political scientists use is a government is an organization that has a monopoly over the use of legitimate violence. So like a government will say, this is a territory, these are the people living inside it, and we, the people, these politicians operating these institutions here, we are the only ones who have the right to use force against anybody within this organization. So like if I argue with one of my neighbors, I can't pull out a gun and shoot my neighbor. That's illegitimate violence. And the government can use legitimate violence to punish me for that. So they can come and say, you're under arrest. And if I say I won't go, they will pull out their guns. They will kill me if they need to do that, because they have the right to do so. And so like a government can say, we're going to use violence to protect you, our people, protect you against neighboring countries. You, the people, don't have the right to use force. You can't go across the border and start shooting people just because you feel threatened by them. We can, your government, we can do that. And that's what we do. And that's what makes us a government as opposed to a church or a bank or some other kind of family or some other kind of organization. So if you define the terms that way, then by definition, there cannot be such a thing as government without monopoly over legitimate violence. It's like they say, one of the things the government will do is raise taxes to pay for its armies and run a legal system to adjudicate disputes between people so they don't fight each other. Well, you can't have a legal system without somebody having legitimate violence to back it up. Like the court can say, you have to do X, and if you don't do it, if you don't have somebody ultimately able to use force to make you do it, you end up just not doing it if you rely on self-help to get things done. So without somebody exercising a claim to use legitimate violence, you can't really have a legal system in the way we understand them in the modern world. So yeah, no violence, no government. Of course, anarchists will tend to say, well, that's fine. We don't need to have governments, because if we had an ideally designed world, then people won't need to be threatened in this sort of way. They will see the common good and they will act on the common good, and we won't need to have somebody waving a big stick to make them do things.
But there's always people that are, say, psychopaths or people who just will not reason. Or, you can just have people with different interests. Mm-hmm. I suppose this is... So what do you think would happen to our society if we abolish the police? What would it... What do you... I know this is a politically loaded question, but maybe you're able to disentangle it somehow. But what do you think would happen to our society if that happened?
Yeah, I mean, the world wouldn't come to an end because, there are plenty of societies that anthropologists have studied that don't have police. In fact, police, as we understand them now, there were no police forces in the world up till almost 200 years ago, when the first British police forces started to get invented. So there was nothing like that. People didn't all kill each other. Because the disputes going on all the time, very, very few of them escalate to the level of violence. So we would get along if there were no police, but there would be more violence. And this is one of the remarkable things about modern wealthy societies, is just how little violence we have, how unlikely it is in the current world, if you live in a rich country, that you're going to die violently, or for that matter, just get beaten up or something. It just happens very, very rarely, because we've pacified these societies. So if we take away police forces, almost certainly what that means is that the amount of use of violence is going to go up, because it's like everybody does a cost-benefit analysis when you're trying to get what you want. How will it go if I use force? If you start, the more you think, there's not actually going to be any penalty for that, the more force will get used. And so this is something that I think the historical record shows this pretty clearly.
So who benefits and who loses?
That's always the question.
Do you have a guess as to who would be on the losing end of it? Would it be people with not money enough to afford their own private security, or who are the people who lose out?
Yeah, judging from the way things have worked in the past, in our world, we tend to think of most non-military violence. We think of it as coming from the dispossessed, from the poor people. People are out there robbing you and attacking you because they're desperate, they got nothing, and so on. And this police statistics suggest that is largely the case, but that was not true of most societies in history. That say in early modern Europe, in the world where Shakespeare lived, 16th century England, you read Shakespeare, those plays, they're remarkable for just how much violence there is. And the violence is coming not from the poor and the dispossessed, but from the wealthy and the powerful. And this, Shakespeare was absolutely right in this regard about the 16th century, that there are governments, but they have a limited ability to project force into the society. They don't have police forces. They often don't have standing armies. The only way a government can get things done is by delegating power to great noblemen to raise armed forces for the government. And these great noblemen want to use those armed forces for themselves as well. So they're constantly feuding with each other. And governments will strike these deals where they say, okay, Duke of Northumberland, or whoever the heck you are, we will let you wage your private vendettas against the Duke of Somerset as long as it doesn't rise to the level that it threatens the stability of the government as a whole. And if it does, then we will crack down on you. Then we get a civil war. And this is where the monopoly on legitimate violence comes in. The minute a king no longer has the ability to beat the Duke of Northumberland in a civil war, he's no longer the king. The Duke of Northumberland is now the king. So the government has to be able to do that. But the governments will tolerate this really high level of violence. So what we would think is a really high level of violence. Because governments now do the same. They tolerate a certain level of violence. It's just that it's much, much lower than it used to be. Like, no government in the world actually seriously tries to stamp out all violent death. Because if it did, it would ban cars. There would be no cars because cars kill so many people. There's all these ways people die violent. The government says, we're not willing to pay that cost in order to get that benefit. It's just that the threshold would rise a heck of a lot higher if you got rid of government, got rid of police.
I see. So because the police and government has a monopoly on violence, I suppose, there's no room for the smaller groups within the society to vie for control of what's already monopolized.
Yeah, and I think what you would see is not so much street crime just exploding, although who knows, maybe that would happen. But you would see the great and the powerful turning to violence much more often. I mean, they talk about if you're rich enough, you can get away with murder, and you probably can. But in a world with no force-based authority backing up law codes, if you're rich enough, you could get away with a heck of a lot more murder.
So another disconnected question. So this will be a little bit out of left field, so I apologize. But okay, so these days we know, as I asked you whether you were sad that you may not see 10,000 years in the future to write your sequel. But we have this normalized situation, which is that people have children, and they know that when they pass away, their children will, take over the mantle. That they will be the next generation. We champion the next generation. It's not a thing of sadness that we're going to be replaced, let's say. But right now, scientists are working on artificial intelligence, and presumably at some point we're going to have an artificial intelligence which is as intelligent, it's a general intelligence that is as intelligent as us. There are these movies like The Matrix or Terminator where the robots take over. So, my question is, if the robots do take over, should we view it more like we view our children replacing us? Is it a sadness, or is it just the next step?
Yeah, I think opinions vary on this, and it is fascinating following at least a little bit what goes on in AI and artificial intelligence. The things we tend to be most interested in is artificial intelligence systems that in some way or other mimic what it is to be a human being. So ones that can interact like us. There's this famous thing about the Turing test that we'll named after Alan Turing, where we'll know that we've sort of crossed a big threshold when we have artificial intelligences that humans can't tell they're artificial. We can't tell the difference anymore between AI and human intelligence. But that's not the way a machine would look at this. A machine would surely say, to the degree that we develop machine consciousness, the machine will surely say, well, why would I want to be a human? I don't want to be like a bad version of a human. I want to be a really good version of a machine. And artificial intelligence will be just that. It will be intelligence that is, from our perspective, artificial. It'll be different from human intelligence. And when we get to the point that the machine-based intelligences are outperforming human intelligences, then I think the sort of scenario you're talking about is going to happen. And I do think one of the things we can be absolutely certain about is, unless we blow all the machines to bits somehow in the meantime, that machine intelligences are just going to become so much more powerful and so different from human intelligences. And whether that means we'll all be living in like Terminator movie landscape or Blade Runner, where evil machines are taking over and we're battling them, or whether it just means that humanity's niche in the world is going to change, maybe for the better. Hard to say. I just think that modern humans are the product of an evolutionary process, that our predecessor species created us by having sex. They didn't know they were creating us, but they did, by having sex and having random mutations on the gene that eventually turn into a new kind of human that is profoundly different from the predecessor species that created it. And one of the differences about us, makes us so different from earlier species of humans, is that we have the ability to evolve culturally as well as biologically. We're continuing to evolve biologically, changing to different animals, but we're also evolving culturally, creating these cultures that are unlike anything the world has ever seen before. And our cultural evolution is already bleeding back into our biological evolution and changing what we are as human beings. And arguably, it's already done more than the last 100 years than all of the evolution humans have seen in the previous 100,000 years. And the coming 100 years is going to see even more of this. So this is going to change what we are as human beings, but it's also going to change the environment within which we are changing. And so in some senses, at least, we are going to be replaced culturally by new kinds of intelligence, new kinds of being that we have created through cultural mechanisms, rather than ones we've just created through the old-fashioned biological mechanisms. So I think that is something we can probably be certain of. But again, whether the visions of what that will look like that people have in the 20th and 21st centuries, whether those come true, or whether, which I think is more likely, is it something beyond our wildest imaginings, that we're just going to have to wait and see how that goes.
There's a famous saying by Einstein that he doesn't know what the Third World War will be fought with, but he knows what the Fourth World War will be fought with. Do you think he's wrong? Do you think he's wrong in the sense that right now we have this conflict again in Ukraine, and the West is imposing these economic sanctions? Do you think what we're going to have is actually a situation where peace and war become so melded together that it might not even be obvious that we're in the Third World War until long after it's over?
Yeah. I mean, American military strategists have taken to not talking anymore about states of peace and war, but talking about what they call a constant state of campaigning, that there's struggle going on at multiple levels all the time. The cyber sphere, economic sphere, physical kinetic violence is one of these levels of struggle, but the stepping over into the kinetic level is not necessarily the biggest threshold, they like to say. Although obviously if it escalates to nuclear warfare, that becomes a very, very different sort of thing. And I think people in Ukraine would have a rather different perspective on this than the theorists in the Pentagon about whether kinetic force is still important. But I mean, Einstein came up with this famous line about knowing the Fourth World War we fought with rocks, whatever they fight the Third World War with, because he was very, very committed to nuclear disarmament. And I would say, I suspect he's right that if there's a Third World War with nuclear weapons, then the consequences are beyond imagining, bad beyond anything we can imagine. Even though we now have only about 10% the number of nuclear warheads that the world had in the 1980s, it's extraordinarily declined the amount of violence potentially there. It still might be enough to wipe out humanity altogether. I mean, an extraordinary amount of potential violence out there. So if there's a nuclear war, all bets are off. This is the most disastrous thing imaginable. But I guess where I differ from Einstein is feeling that we're not going to avoid that by attempting to get to a zero nuclear world. Nuclear disarmament is kind of unrealistic. These things cannot be, having been invented, they cannot be uninvented. And it would be a major effort now, if we sort of got rid of all the infrastructure, it would be a big effort to go from scratch to having thousands of nuclear warheads again. But it could be done. You know, we've got these things, they cannot be made to go away now. So the challenge is to make a world where the benefits of fighting with nuclear weapons, the benefits don't outweigh the costs, so that even a Vladimir Putin will see that if I use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster for me, beyond calculation. And so that's the kind of world we've got to create. And one of the weird sort of paradoxical things is that since nuclear weapons came into the world, there have been so many fewer great power wars than there were before nuclear weapons came into the world, because they've dramatically raised the costs of interstate violence. And so I think that's something we should be playing on, learning to leverage the nuclear forces out there, along with other things like economic tools, to raise the costs of using violence.
That you've survived all my questions. Thank you so much for coming on again, Ian.
Thank you for having me. This is such a lot of fun.
Escaped Sapiens.